Channel open. Welcome back to WeeklyTrek, a proud member of the Tricorder Transmissions podcast network and presented in partnership with TrekCore.com. I am your host, Alex Perry.
What's today's date? The date.
Today's show was recorded on March 11th, 2023, and is current through the Star Trek Picard episode No-Win Scenarios, so beware of spoilers. All right, let's get into the show.
Good day, Voyager, and welcome to A Briefing with Neelix. It's a catchy title, isn't it?
WeeklyTrek is a regular news show covering the biggest stories from the Star Trek franchise. We are in a new golden age of Star Trek. There are 5 television shows in production, for now, possibly more on the way, and enough merchandise to fill the Bajoran wormhole. So stick with me, and I'll help you sort the real facts from lots of the Dominion propaganda that you'll find online. But I can't do this alone, and my guest this week is returning guest and co-host of Filibuster on the Nerd Party podcast network. It's Lee Hutchison. Lee, welcome back to WeeklyTrek.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I feel like it's always a privilege when Star Trek's on the air and we can talk a little bit about an episode and the news. It's the perfect double bill.
It's a true double header. Well, all right, Lee, you know the drill. I want to know something that's got you excited about Star Trek at the moment. What's got you moving at Warp 10?
So we'll take Star Trek Picard season 3 as a given.
Yes.
And it's been kind of one of those ones I've been reflecting where there's been so much discussion about endings. Like people have been talking about the final season of Picard. Now we have the final season of Discovery, and just sort of this wave now of things potentially wrapping up. There's no Star Trek 14 on the horizon. And I was kind of thinking as well, there's another bit of Star Trek that's kind of going to end this year, and that's the Delta Flyers podcast. And it's been one of those ones, I kind of started listening to it the beginning of lockdown. I think it came out May 2020. We're still all in peak lockdown, hair's all long, bushy beards, and it's finally just entered season 7 after 3 years. And it's been one of those ones where you kind of start to think, oh, I've heard all these stories before. What are Robert McNeil and Garrett Wang going to talk about that's anything remotely new? There's so many great fan podcasts out there going through episode at a time. But I must admit, I've had the best time in these past 3 years with these guys. And what I find amazing is that for so many of us that maybe go to conventions or on kind of part of that Star Trek online community, we hear so many of the same old stories and we're kind of roll our eyes going, yeah, I've heard this. But each week there's always that something different. I never thought I'd hear Robert McNeil's thoughts on Unimatrix Zero, for example,
right.
Or various other ones. And I've just really enjoyed those behind the scenes. And I think for what I think it amounts to $5 a month, I've been part of their Patreon, and I love what they've decided to do, that we have To the Journey coming out maybe in the next year or so, and there's going to be so many interviews, but I already feel like I'm getting a nice dose of that once a month. We get so many of the behind the scenes talent and the writers on the cast coming on to talk about their experiences. They had a brilliant episode where they had Brian Fuller on for about a 3-hour long episode going,
yep,
let's just talk about the making of Bride of Chaotica. And I just love all that. And I feel like they've made a kind of oral history about Star Trek Voyager that's really going to stand the test of time, and something that I can almost see starting to fill up places like Memory Alpha with extra anecdotes or insights that, I guess, for a show that's been off the air for over 20 years, there's so many new things that we're learning. So yeah, I'm really excited for this final year of the podcast and maybe what they're going to do next.
Yeah, I am also a fan of the Delta Flyers. I started listening to it, with the first episode and have carried all the way through. I think I'm 4 or 5 behind, but I'm 4 or 5 behind in pretty much everything. And yeah, it's very listenable. I really enjoy hearing them talk about the episodes every week. I enjoy hearing them sort of go through the struggles of trying to remember stuff sometimes, right? Whole episodes that prior to them rewatching it, they're I have no memory of this episode ever happening. But of course, then they watch it and it comes back as it would if we had access to 178 weekly installments of a thing that we did, 25 years ago at this point. But yeah, it's great. I will be interested to see what they do next. And I think, real kudos to them, actually. They have pretty much put out a weekly podcast every week for the last 3 years. And I don't even do that, right? I mean, this show is called WeeklyTrek. And I think last year I managed to get 40 out of 52 weeks had an episode. And I think they had 52 out of 52. That's how good they've been about making sure that this happens. And yeah, there are some standout ones. The episode that you mentioned where they talked to Brian Fuller. There was another episode recently where they had the guest actress from Ashes to Ashes on.
Yeah. I didn't realize she nearly was to Paul. I couldn't believe that when they came out. You were like, I thought I knew everything about Star Trek. I did not know she was in the running to be T'Pol. There's just all those little touches where you just kind of go, wow, I didn't expect to know that as a fan and so on. And it brings to life this kind of rich history, and that it makes me excited for almost to the journey of like what more can be kind of pulled out that I guess I never even knew and show me up as a fan, I guess.
Well, it's also interesting too, because one of the other things I like about it is you're not just experiencing this with Robbie and with Garrett from the perspective of them being actors who worked on the show, right? Like they do approach each episode with that element of like, yeah, we're on the show, so let's talk about what it was like to be on the show. But they also come at it from the perspective of like, we're watching this as, I guess, now Star Trek fans themselves, right? Who are watching every episode and processing it as not as a work experience that they had 20 years ago, but as a piece of television that they're watching for entertainment. And it's fascinating to sort of have gotten to know, like, what does Robbie Duncan McNeil think makes a good Star Trek episode, right? Like, I think I have a pretty good handle on that now, having listened to a bunch of episodes of the Delta Flyers. And I think that's fun too. It sort of gives you a peek inside both of these stars' minds.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's definitely one of those ones. It's definitely been one of the best investments I've ever made, that couple of dollars a month just for that extra material. And yeah, I'm just so glad something out there. Like I originally, when I started watching it, I was like, you know what, I'm going to watch an episode in sync. And it was kind of lockdown. I was like, I kind of started wanting to watching more. So I think I finished it within a few months. And I'm like, oh, I could have maybe just watched it along with them, but it was fantastic. And yeah, I'm sure we're going to see more of them in the future in Star Trek in some way or another.
All right, let me tell you what I'm feeling good about Star Trek this week. And this is a Star Trek Picard conversation, and specifically about the villains of season 3, who now have been revealed to be the Changelings. So funny, they've been saying fallout from the Dominion War, Star Trek Picard is a continuation of Deep Space Nine as well. And like all of our heads went to the Breen for some reason and like just jumped over the Changelings entirely. But like here we are now, it's established by episode 4, Vadic's a Changeling. The rest of the, right, like the enemy this season is the Changelings. And I think that's really awesome. And here's why I think that's really awesome. Obviously, number one, because the Changelings are a cool alien. I really like that. But number two, what's one thing that fans have sort of wished that they had seen in the late 1990s, right? Like, what was the Enterprise E up to during the Dominion War? We still don't really have a good handle on that. Obviously, insurrection takes place during the middle of Deep Space Nine season 7, so those events happened during the Dominion War, but like we didn't see or hear anything about the Enterprise's involvement in the war itself. And so there's always been this question in my mind, which is like, how, right, like we saw how Sisko and crew handled the Changelings. How would Picard and crew have handled the Changelings? And guess what? 20 years later, we're about to find out, right? Like we're seeing it happen right now. We are getting the TNG crew versus the Changelings. And I think that's awesome, right? Like, because really the only reference in any TNG related product to any of the sort of Deep Space Nine-y type events and the Dominion and the Changelings is in Insurrection, where there are a couple of throwaway mentions of the Dominion, but that's it. And so like, and there are a couple of books. There's the Dominion War quadrilogy by, I think, John Vaughan-Holt, and then there's the Battle of Bases Ed, which are books about the Enterprise E during the Dominion War, but that's really it. And so, like, I think it's really cool that now we're having an opportunity to see how would TNG have done DS9. That's massively overly simplistic.
You're spot on. One of my feelings when I watched, I've been similar to yourself. I was privileged enough to get the first six episodes, and I'll probably talk a little bit about my experience with them later on. But I remember just sort of like we had a little group chat, me and a couple of friends, as we watched the episodes, and just my immediate reaction was like, we finally get to see how the Enterprise crew would react with the Changeling threat. And there's just something about watching that where it just feels so exciting, and to just even hear the words like shapeshifters, Odo, Dominion, all these things just flow out. Yeah, it just gets you so excited, and you're like, it scratches that itch where going, I can finally see what that was like, and I feel all the more happier. And you can sort of retroactively go back in your head, and you can hear those words coming out of these characters' mouths and going, okay, I can imagine what it might have been like on an Enterprise at that time of the war. It's just something I always wanted to see and was disappointed I never got at the time. There was always, I remember theories and forums at the time going, oh, the Enterprise is going to come in the last few episodes. And you're like, yes, we'll finally get to see it. And it never happened. And I've been really excited about that. And as soon as it happened, I was like, I'm in. in for this. Like, of course it's the shapeshifters. How did I not see this coming?
Yeah, like, that sort of piece around, there was not even really a mention of the TNG. There was not any mention of the TNG crew during You Were Cordially Invited, Worf's wedding, right? Where you would have thought that he would have wanted his friends from the Enterprise to have had some role in that. So it's just like fast forward, Picard season 3, TNG versus the Changelings. Yep, I'm pretty damn happy with that. Let's see more of it. I'm looking forward to the remainder of this season.
You and me both.
All right, well, with that, let's turn to the week's top stories.
There's a war going on, and I'm a reporter.
Well, it has been revealed this week in an exclusive posted over at trekmovie.com that Robert Beltran, who played Chakotay in Star Trek Voyager, was offered and then subsequently turned down a role in Star Trek Picard Season 2. Responding to an irate Chakotay fan who was annoyed to see that Chakotay was not included in Star Trek Picard Season 3, boy, Chakotay fans sure are protective of the character, Beltran responded on Twitter that, quote, "I was offered an episode, first 2, then 1 in Picard, but I simply did not like what they had written for Chakotay, so I turned them down. I won't go into detail, but I have no animosity towards the Picard producers at all. Star Trek Prodigy offers a Chakotay that I am enthusiastic about." Trek Movie then pitched that question to Terry Matalas, the showrunner for Star Trek Picard, who provided a few more details. He said that Beltran had not been offered a Season 3 role. In fact, he had been offered a role in Season 2, specifically to play Confederation President Annika Hansen's husband in the second episode of the season, Penance. The role would have seen Chakotay occupying the unnamed magistrate role that was ultimately played in the episode by John Briones. Matalas also said that conceptualizing the role as being Chakotay didn't go all that far, particularly once Beltran indicated he was not interested in returning. But it certainly would have been interesting to see a Confederation version of Chakotay, one who married Annika Hansen, no less. The C7 timeline would truly have been the worst timeline of them all. Lee, how do you feel about Robert Beltran's almost return to live action in Star Trek Picard?
It's quite funny. Sometimes with these kind of headlines and news, like I wake up to them when people have already had 7 or 8 hours of discourse in America about them. And I went into a group chat that I've got with some fellow Star Trek fans, and I saw that someone had shared the headline in there, and I was like, like, in Season 3, and I'm just trying to kind of picture where he could fit in. And then I kind of click on the article and it's sort of Season 2. And I kind of chuckle to myself where, like, much like yourself of like, it's the worst timeline. Like the only universe where their relationship could have continued is this crazy fascist sort of universe. And you're like, yeah, that scans. Like that is very funny. And you kind of think like Terry Matalas, like it goes back to Delta Flies. I think they've spoken about how, like, his brief involvement on Voyager. It's like he's someone that knows his Voyager as well. He's been there, and I think he'd probably almost be in on that kind of joke of like, God, the fans are really going to freak about this, because I think Matalas was the one that wrote that episode, or episode 2, I think. So I can imagine his kind of sense of humor perhaps being behind something like that. I mean, I must admit, I was surprised he turned it down. I think he's an odd actor sometimes. Like, yeah, you kind of wonder, like, why would you turn that down? Like, you can imagine some people like would be jumping at opportunities to do this. And I was also thinking as well, it's very odd that he would have technically been, to date, the only one in this sort of new Trek timeline where a former actor or talent had been involved that appeared in not one but 2 of the different series. And it's like, for a character and for an actor that has spoken about his perhaps disdain or difficulties with Star Trek in the past, and for a character that doesn't have a lot of love from the fans, or general fans probably would be fair to say. I was very surprised that we could have had him in Prodigy and Picard. And for some, we're lucky if we've even got them showing up as a random appearance in one show. So very interesting to kind of see the prevalence of Chakotay potentially that we could have had. Yeah, it is sort of a strange one. I mean, first of all, I think it's a sign that Robert Beltran doesn't have a sense of humor, which we already kind of knew was the case. For those of you who are big Chakotay fans, that's wonderful. I think Chakotay is wonderful. I think Beltran can be a little bit of a prickly, and I'll stop myself from saying more at that point. And I think if it was anybody else, they probably would have said yes to it. I think it's an interesting role. I think it's fun, right? I think it's fun that it pokes a little bit of fun itself at the, Chakotay 7 romance from the end of Star Trek Voyager. Like, I think this would have been a fun thing to do, especially because probably around this time, he already knew about the Prodigy thing happening. And it's like, okay, well, if you are feeling protective enough of the character that you don't want like a fascist version of him, which I guess
that part of it I understand and, sympathize with the decision that you wouldn't want to do that. But it's like, okay, but you also get the real Chakotay back as well. So like, why not come back and have some fun with it? But yes, like of all of the characters that I would want to appear in multiple Star Treks in the current iteration, I'm not sure that Chakotay is necessarily all that high on my list, right? Like probably top, my top would be William T. Riker, which great, cross that off the list. And then, some of the others directly under that are ones that have been in one already. But yeah, Robert Beltran would join Gates McFadden and Jonathan Frakes as the only two actors. I'm going out on a limb here. Someone's going to tell me and Marina Sirtis, the four legacy actors who have appeared in, at this point, at least one of the Kurtzman era Star Trek productions, reprising their legacy character roles.
Yeah, it's so bizarre. I mean, I completely forgot about Gates McFadden being in Prodigy, but I'll maybe put it down to her being a hologram. But yeah, it's a very odd one, to be honest. But yeah, it's one of those things. I think it's easy to probably look into, but probably very easy development stages of like, would you be interested? No? Okay, we move on and so on. But it's just quite amazing that almost like 18 months and we never ever knew that was a potential thing. We get so many of these great articles from the producers, the writers, actors after the episodes drop, and no one ever kind of mentioned, in our first iteration, we had kind of Chakotay involved and so on. So it's amazing it just took someone randomly tweeting that out to make it happen. I wonder how many other near misses we might have had. We just need to start randomly tweeting every actor that's still alive from Star Trek.
That is the exact question that's at the top of my mind too. It's like, how many others are out there, right? Because certainly from the perspective of Terry Matalas, so far we now know they were trying to find a place for Chakotay in the Confederation timeline in season 2. They were trying to find a place for Naomi Wildman in season 3. That would have been awesome as well. And then we have sort of other actors who have kind of said that they've been offered things that ultimately didn't materialize or haven't materialized yet. Flashback to Robert Picardo saying that he'd been offered a role in, I think it was Star Trek Picard. Well, we're 6 episodes away away from the end of Star Trek Picard at this point, and we ain't seen no Bob Picardo yet. Now, that doesn't mean that he's not going to show up at some point in, the remaining episodes of this season. But that could be another thing too, where it's like, they reached out and said, we are thinking about this. We're interested. Are you interested? He said yes. And then ultimately the story and the scripting went in a completely different direction. And they ultimately decided, not to use that character. So it's interesting to think about like what else within the creative process came up and was dismissed, not just for Picard, but also for Lower Decks and for Prodigy and for Discovery and Strange New Worlds as well. There are certain characters, that could appear in those productions as well. But yeah, it's a fun story. It's nice to peek behind the creative curtain, and it's fun to peek behind the creative curtain and find that the creatives behind that curtain are thinking the kind of things that like we would want them to think.
Yeah.
Well, this week's Star Trek Picard episode, No Win Scenario, has been receiving near universal plaudits for its tight character work, strong action, and many connections to the Star Trek canon. Picard showrunner and episode co-writer Terry Matalas spoke to Maggie Lovett from Collider about the episode, which gives us the deepest look yet at the overall direction of this season. In the interview, Matalas offered his most extensive comments yet on the decision to introduce Jack Crusher to Picard's life. It started with the question of, what's the last unexplored relationship in Picard's life, Matalas said, and it felt like it was a son, and the best way to explore that would be with a son who's fully formed, who's grown up, and there's no good drama if the son is, I love you, you love me. It's a boring scene, but a son that he doesn't understand and a son that doesn't understand him, that's good drama. So you have to find the least contrived way to make that work, and that's tough and fair fan criticism to say that it is slightly contrived, because it is. However, if the scene works and the emotional satisfaction of watching it all works, then it's worth it, and we think it is here. These performances with Ed and Patrick in the bar were worth it all for us, and with Gates to be able to get these performances and to have them really sink their teeth into things they've never really done before. And I think by the end of this episode, you feel like you're with Beverly Crusher and Picard again, in ways that you felt like they were with The Next Generation. We haven't scarred anybody in any way, so that's how you have to approach it. Matalas also talked about how it came to be that Jonathan Frakes ended up directing Riker's biggest episodes of the season. It just worked out that way, he said. In fact, I was quite worried about it. We were going to have him direct a different batch, and another director, a dear friend of mine, fell out because of COVID protocols. And so it was like, hey, look, Jonathan, it can only be you to do this, but it's going to be tremendously hard. I've got to tell you, he didn't miss a beat. There wasn't a day he came in exhausted. I don't know how he did it. Every day he came in with a great attitude, did both, and we had his back. We were able to watch, and when he couldn't see and be like, you're going to want to go again, or whatever, I think episode 4 is the best thing he's ever done. I really do. Matalas also talked about the decision to make the Changelings the main villain of the season. He said, quote, "It was right away early on. They were the perfect villain because they can look like anybody, and there's an episode around the midpoint where it is absolutely critical, where you're not sure if the person sitting across from you is a changeling or not, and the only way that you can know is to have an emotional catharsis with that person. It gives you such incredible drama, and it wouldn't have worked. I do like the conspiracy bugs. I did consider them for a hot minute, the conspiracy bugs. The issue with the conspiracy bugs, aka the creatures from the first season Next Generation episode Conspiracy, is they kill their host. So that would mean anybody that you saw with a bug in them was dead, and you wouldn't be able to do the paranoia thriller that you wanted to do if it was somebody you loved. That meant they were dead. So there were about 3 storylines I couldn't do without killing legacy characters." And with her, Deanna Troi, across the first 4 episodes of season 3, "Don't worry," Matalas said. Quote, "Troi plays heavily in the back 5 episodes of this season. The back half of the season is Troi's season." Well, there is a ton more in the interview, so make sure to check out the show notes for the link to read the whole thing. Lee, what was your reaction to the episode No-Win Scenario?
Oh, I loved it, Alex. And it's one of those things, I'm not saying this by kind of just that, oh, I watched this 48 hours ago and it's the newest episode, because I've been loving them all. But when, I don't know how you kind of experienced all when these screeners dropped, but I had a crazy day where I'd been at a wedding the night before. I'd kind of come home and these screeners dropped about sort of 10 o'clock at night, and me and my partner were about to kind of call it a night. We were finished watching an episode of The Traitors, and we're like, right, come on, let's dive in. Let's watch the first episode and we'll maybe watch some more. So we got to about 2 a.m. and finished episode 2. And then we're like, right, we need to sleep, watch these other ones. But I must admit, I'm someone that needs to go to bed at 10 o'clock at night. I struggle, but I was like buzzing at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I feel like this episode is the end of this kind of first 4 episode kind of arc. You know, we've kind of met these new kind of characters. We've solved an adventure, but this feels like, I feel like this term gets loaded a lot because it feels like a dig, but this feels like true Star Trek when I think about it. It's like science, teamwork, the crew coming together. There was so many moments that I was just kind of like, just really happy watching it. And there's a brilliant moment which I think really sums up where I think this season is kind of going and why I love what they've done this season. It's Crusher's like, look at us. We're all here for a reason. Let's do what we do best. And I feel like that's what we've been seeing the best of, all these characters. And I just thought it was just beautifully done. You know, just the conversations and the meditations on kind of life and death. And basically our pre-title sequence is like Riker just talking about how he's been looking into the abyss of just nothing and death and so on. And that's the type of conversations that you maybe have got on Deep Space Nine, but like it felt so beautiful. And Frakes has never been better as a director and as an actor. And I just thought it was lovely, and it all coming together where I just had the biggest smile on my face as this Nebula becomes a life form, and you just go, this is Star Trek with the Next Generation. And what I loved about it, and I'm not saying that I needed that retread all these years later, but that's what I love about Star Trek. It's not always about the action or the violence or things like this, but just this right here. And I think this episode was the perfect antithesis of something that they're aiming to do and achieve. And I kind of was reflecting on this episode when I rewatched it the other day, where I was like, this episode could, you know, I guess these first few episodes could have gone other ways. I remembered reading about the casting of the actor behind Jack Crusher. His name's just completely escaped me there.
Ed Spiliers.
That's the one. I remember hearing about it months and months ago, and then it just vanished from the thing. You were like, oh yeah, that's clearly going to be their kid. And I kind of forgot about it, truth be told. And I remembered sort of at the end of episode 1, you're like, yeah, it's clearly the kid. And I was a bit wary at first, because one of my favorite moments in Star Trek history is that kind of end of generations where Picard has gone on this journey, and he doesn't need to leave a legacy in the form of kids or family. It's about how he lives his life and treats others. And for someone that doesn't want kids, I was kind of like, yeah, that's representation that matters. And the idea that he needs this, they're going to bring in this kid, I thought, oh, it's kind of, you know, is this something that we really need? Is this something that's just being added in as this kind of big finale style thing? But God, it's been so good. I mean, the acting, the discussions, how they've written it has been fantastic. fantastically done. And just, I was worried it would undermine one of my favorite moments, but that moment is still valid. Life changes. It's been nearly 30 years since that moment. Of course, he might have changed his mind. I get that. But equally, I just loved Shaw's Jaws moment, you know, when he gets to echo the other Shaw and share his harrowing story. And I must admit, again, I'd been really worried in those first few episodes of like, I really like this character, but are they just making him basically a big D from Chicago, and they're going to kill him off because he's got this injury and it's just to put Riker in the captain's position? But no, they avoided what could have been a really cliched moment, and continues to be one of my favorite kind of characters in this Star Trek in general. And I'm so excited to see where all of them go. I just think what a brilliant 4 hours of TV, and now we go into the next phase of this grand story, I think.
Yeah, I am actually right alongside you. I do also share some very conflicted emotions about the decision to make Picard a father, because it does feel a bit like that was not the sort of meta direction for the character, and that was a question that the character had sort of dealt with earlier in his life and made a decision, and then it's like, regardless of how he feels about the consequences of that decision today, right? That was a decision that he made and that lots of people, have made, and nobody else kind of gets to discover later on in life they have a secret son, right? It's like, generations is that point where it's like, I don't think this is going to happen for me. And then life proceeds from there. And it's like, it does sort of undo that a little bit. Having said that, though, and my own kind of, personal foibles with that aside, it's a wonderful relationship. There are wonderful scenes in this episode. Spaliers really holds his own against Sir Patrick Stewart. I mean, I talked last week about how much I like the character of Jack Crusher. And I think the character of Jack Crusher is really wonderful as a young Jean-Luc Picard archetype from everything we've been told about young Jean-Luc. But it's tough to go toe to toe with Sir Patrick, and Ed Spaliers just does it, from the get-go. And this episode is sort of the I think kind of crescendo of that, given that you get much more focused time between these two characters in this episode than you did in last week's episode. Sure, amazing, right? The only Borg so deadly they gave him a goddamn name is one of those lines that has just been swimming around in my head for weeks at this point and won't go anywhere. I mean, that's how good that scene is and that line itself is. And I'm really kind of pleased with the way that the character is developing and sort of starting to gel within the character dynamics of not just with Seven. I really love the kind of buddy cop comedy thing we have going on between those two in this episode, right? Well, buddy cop, but they're buddy cops who hate each other, but they have to work together. But they're developing that sort of grudging respect for each other, and maybe they'll like each other at the end, but they'll never express it, all right? That feels like the Shaw-Seven relationship that's emerging in this episode. And I'm so pleased that Shaw is sort of integrating into this ensemble alongside Jack Crusher, alongside Sidney LaForge, so that it's not just the TNG crew and Seven of Nine and Raffi, that it is, the TNG crew and Seven of Nine and Raffi and Liam Shaw and Sidney LaForge and Jack Crusher, right? You have this really interesting mix of characters that, is just really terrific and fabulous to see. And this episode is very Star Trek, right? Having the ending be a sort of Strange New Worlds moment, right? Not a Strange New Worlds moment like the show Strange New Worlds, but a Strange New Worlds moment like a Seek Out New Life and Civilizations moment is fun. And especially tying back to, space life forms, Encounter at Farpoint, right? You end back at the beginning. You talked about how you watched those first 6 episodes. I am also the kind of person who I can make it till probably about 11:30, 11:45, and that's me done. And that's where I got to at the end of episode 4, and I was like, this feels like a good pause point. I've still got 2 more, but I can't do it tonight. I was the only one of my friends not to do it. They all watched all 6, so I then had to avoid the group chat for 24 hours until I could come back and watch 5 and 6. But it's a really nice end to the first act of the season, and there's I think, hey, we're at the point now, for those who've seen 6 episodes, there's only 2 episodes left that we have seen, right? People are mostly caught up at this stage. And I'm really excited to see where season 3 goes from here and what the final act of the season ultimately looks like.
And the thing I've loved about it the most, and it's one of these things, I think sometimes that we need perspective outside of the fandom, where it feels like Picard has been a kind of breakout hit in terms of coverage and discussion. Agreed. And for me, I watched the 6 episodes with my partner, and she's someone that will randomly watch an episode of Star Trek with me where I'm like, oh, I'm going to chuck on My Little Ship, which we watched the other day while I was half asleep on the couch. And she was like, we were watching it together. And she was like, I wish I had some more Star Trek fans that I knew that I could be excited, that I could share what I'm up to right now. And when she got to the end of those episodes, she was like, I really enjoyed that. That meant a lot. I think it's really interesting, these dynamics. I really love this new character. That legacy character is interesting. What episodes would you recommend about that? And we get so used to like people having these discussions in the past few weeks where it's like, it's all nostalgia, it's just all aimed at these old fans. I sit next to someone and I'm like, are you enjoying this? Yeah, this makes sense to me. Oh, this is really exciting. And she was like the other day, so what episode are we up to now? Is it when's the next episode that I can watch that's going to be a brand new one, for example? And, those things are always great to hear from out with the bubble to make sure that things are landing and so on. And it's not just something that's aimed at the fans that have been there all their lives and so on, that we're the ones that might pick up on the Easter eggs, or maybe we have to just explain what the changelings were. But the reality is it's a show that works for other people as well. And yeah, it's been something I'm excited that I get to share Trek with someone for the first time, and kind of they can see me enthusiastic about a nebula turning into a space creature and going, that's Star Trek right there.
Well, fallout continues from the announcement last week that Star Trek Discovery's 5th season was being delayed to early 2024 and would be the show's last. Jonathan Frakes, who was the first major Star Trek star from Legacy Star Trek to have a role in the new era of Star Trek, beginning with his direction of Star Trek Discovery all the way back in Season 1, talked a little about the show's cancellation in the middle of press for Picard Season 3. I'm disappointed, Frakes said. In many ways, it was my new home show. When I started on that show in Season 1, it was a return to the Star Trek world for me, so I had a very strong connection to it, and I feel the pain. It's show business, but it still sucks. And speaking of the show's plans for how to end it, Frakes merely said, quote, I think they've got a stunning plan for a very satisfying ending. And given that Frakes directed the penultimate episode of Season 5, you have to wonder what those comments ultimately mean in terms of rounding things out. Will there be new episodes shot to craft an ending to Star Trek Discovery, reshooting the final episode, or is Frakes going to help reshoot parts of the penultimate episode as well? Well, I think we will just have to wait to find out. Lee, what do you hope for from the end of Star Trek Discovery?
I hope it's something that I'm excited about, and it's been kind of a weird few weeks. So I was reflecting on that article by Frakes, and it was an interesting kind of evening, because I think it's almost one of those ones, it's like whenever something big happens in Star Trek history, whether it's the cancellation of Enterprise, Patrick Stewart's returning, the 2009 movie, you kind of remember where you are when something like that happened. And it was kind of a bit surreal because I was out, I think he's going to be up on your show very soon, but I was out for dinner and wine with Carlos Miranda, a fellow great Star Trek fan. And it was just about like, we literally just said goodbye, and by the time we both got home, the news had broken. We were like, where was this news that we could have talked about over a glass of wine like a half an hour ago? But while we were kind of out, we were like, do you remember what Season 4 of Discovery was about? And it's like, I can't remember what Season 3 was about. And it's one of those ones that all Star Trek is good Star Trek. It always passes that line for me. And I've loved some of Discovery. Some of it I've been lukewarm on. But it's been interesting to kind of see what feels like a kind of sense of apathy about the news. And I remember back when Enterprise was cancelled, I was still just finishing secondary school at the time, and being on forums and discussions like, what do we do? How do we bring it back? Campaigns, writing. I mean, that's always been the history of Star Trek, all the way back from movies to the original cancellation or the end of Season 2. There feels like a sense of apathy about Discovery's kind of coming to an end. And it feels almost like we had this news, people went, oh, it's ending. Okay, we've had a bit of a weekly discussion about it. It's good, maybe it's bad. Wow, 5 seasons, great. And everyone's kind of moved on. It's like, but what about this next episode of Picard and beyond and so on? And it's kind of I find that just a bit sad, really. Like, that's Star Trek should always be special to an extent. And, you feel for people like Frakes and the cast and the crew that have been involved, that's their jobs and labor of love. And it feels odd that us as fans, even myself as a huge diehard Star Trek fan, is kind of like, okay. Is it similar to what you spoke about last week, where we've reached this big wave and there's just so much of it that's like, that's gone. But hey, we've got Picard Season 3 this week. Oh, we've got Lower Decks to come. We've got Strange New Worlds. Will that get more episodes now? It's been so bizarre. And, in terms of however they end it, it feels like it was taken away before it should have done. Like, my view was that when I thought the next season of Discovery would be the end, not the one that they're now retroactively turning into an end, but they would announce Season 6, this is the end, and it'd be a big kind of celebration, a closure, give what basically relaunched this new golden age of Star Trek a send-off. And it just feels kind of really a bit sad. And even sort of the conversation that Frakes had in the article was like, yeah, I don't see 32nd century shows happening. And even then, there just feels like, as fans, there's not been that much of an attachment. You know, none of us, we spent 2 seasons in that world, maybe third, and none of us feel that attached to it to an extent. And I feel like that's just been a missed opportunity to have gone into the future. And, you know, I don't know, it's just, I feel disappointed and I wish I cared a little bit more. I'm a bit sad about the whole thing, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was, you know, as I was putting together the plan for this week's episode, I was like, you know, it feels like there's a week 2 to the Discovery cancellation story, right? Like last week was the news that it was cancelled. This week is the news that blank. And I really struggled. I mean, outside of all the stories saying Discovery's been cancelled, you know, that repeated the same information over and over again. Trek had one, Trek Movie had one, all the trades had one. There's really just kind of been 2 pieces that have run after that, right? Trek Movie did a piece that sort of included, you know, it was just sort of a compilation of tweets from actors and writers and producers, you know, about once the news had come out, you know, sort of talking about like the fact that it was happening. And then there was this one, and I decided to go with this one because I thought, you know, Frakes' comments about the end of the series, even though he doesn't say anything, still do sort of hint at something, right, that like we can speculate wildly about. But yeah, I was sort of expecting more of a week 2 to the story, and I didn't realistically think that was going to accrue to, like, as you were talking about, right, like a 2005 style, there's going to be a picket outside of Paramount Studios. Granted, it was a very small one because Enterprise at that point, like there was a level of franchise fatigue. It was not, you know, it was not 1968 and the letter writing campaign to get Star Trek renewed for season 3. But I did kind of think, you know, would there be something more about that, or, you know, or would there be more kind of talk about like why this happened and what this means and what's happening next? And there isn't. I mean, partially that will come because now they have pushed Discovery season 5 to next year. I think they have time to sort of figure things out as it relates to the ending and then tell us about what that means, you know, at a later time. And it doesn't have to be now, but it is also just a little bit like, I don't know, I would have thought there would have been more conversation about the end of Discovery, and maybe the fact that there hasn't been sort of indicates part of the reason why it's ending with season 5, right? That like it does feel as though all of the things that you said about the attention of the fans and of the fandom, you know, has sort of shifted away from Discovery and from the 32nd century. I don't think I agree with Frakes, just based off of the rumors that have been flying around about the Starfleet Academy show being set in the 32nd century. I think that's where the Starfleet Academy show is going to be set, and that we will continue to have a show set in that time frame. But I echo all of your comments about that time frame itself, and I really hope that if Star Trek as a franchise is going to spend more time in the 32nd century, they do a much better job, in my opinion, and maybe they'll do this in season 5 of Discovery, of fleshing out the world, and the world as a Star Trek world, and not the world as a, what to me feels more like generic science fiction-y, you know, sort of setting, rather than a specifically Star Trek setting. I need more Star Trek in my 32nd century than I have gotten to this point, and hey, maybe the next show will do that.
And I think one thing, it's even just things I feel like is, you know, I think there'll be time to kind of mourn it when it kind of comes along and we can properly reflect on it. But I was struck by, I think it was either yourself or your guest last week, of like Discovery was unapologetically what it was. You know, there's not really ever been a Star Trek show quite like it in terms of the representation. And, you know, so many of the times where elements of our own fandom, outside forces, were kind of very negative about some of the representation. They were like, more, we're going to double down on this. You want trans characters? Here's trans characters. Hey, Star Trek has done a really awful job over the 50 odd years of LGBT plus representation. Here's more of it. And I love it for that and so on. And I see it where last week where I saw so many fans kind of reflecting on it and mourning it and talking about what it meant to them, how it got them into this fandom that we all love. And that's amazing. And I just wish I'd felt the same as well, and that there was more people that perhaps maybe putting up a fight or at least giving it a bit of a show. And yeah, it's maybe just, as I say, there's an element of too much Star Trek to an extent where things like this just kind of do get met with a bit of a shrug. And yeah, I hope, you know, next year as they drop and, you know, they crew go on publicity tours and it becomes the main focus again for 10, 12 weeks, that they get celebrated, and we really do remember its mark. And I'm sure there'll be lots of great articles and think pieces that will come and so on. And I think I look forward to reading those.
Well, and lastly this week, Peekskill Productions in New York City have announced they will be premiering an off-Broadway Star Trek parody musical, which will debut this spring. Entitled Khan the Musical, a parody Trektacular, the synopsis for the show reads: it is 2366, and Data the android presents his campy musical adaptation of The Wrath of Khan. In this sci-fi send-up, an older Captain Kirk is experiencing a coming-of-middle-age story when his nemesis Khan escapes exile and vows revenge. The ensuing cat-and-mouse game sparks an adventure that includes Vulcan tap dancing, Kirk's long-lost son, a William Shatner impersonator, and, of course, mutant space chickens. Co-writer and composer for the show, Brent Black, had this to say about the production. Something about a Wrath of Khan musical kept nagging at me. Eventually, my friend Alina came up with an idea that the musical itself could be a simulation within the universe of Star Trek, which led to the concept of Data presenting a holographic musical that he programmed himself. A lot of episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation feature storylines where Data has to learn something through trial and error, usually going a little too far or taking things a bit too literally. The idea that he would write a musical after studying classic Broadway shows of the past opened the concept of the show even wider to include send-ups of classic musicals. The show runs from Thursday, May 4th until Sunday, June 4th, and will be at the Players Theatre in New York City. Tickets range between $25 and $65. Head on over to khaniscoming.com for tickets. Lee, if you lived in New York, do you think you'd check out this new Star Trek parody musical?
Oh, of course I would go see it. And I'm more frustrated when I saw the announcement. I was like, so we get a parody Star Trek Wrath of Khan off-Broadway show before we get the Khan podcast miniseries or whatever Nicholas Meyer was kicking up years ago. I was like, God damn it, like if I could pick one out of the two, or clearly someone had a monkey paw and clearly asked for the wrong thing. But yeah, I think Star Trek does lend itself quite well to, I guess, things like parody and stuff to an extent. Whether that's always successfully done or not remains to be seen. But I mean, if you're going to kind of turn something of Star Trek into kind of a theatrical play, something around the Wrath of Khan kind of works. I mean, the whole thing is so theatrical and it's big in the performances, the use of Shakespeare, literary references, and even just sort of the production elements where it's like, it's pretty much all on just a couple of different sets and so on. So it kind of lends itself quite well in scope and scale to kind of being on Broadway. So I'd be quite curious to see it. I've had this discussion many a time with some friends in relation to film and theatre, that there's so many great plays out there that unless you're lucky enough to get a ticket, you are never ever going to get to see it on any format. You can never just sort of kick up an app and go, oh, I want to watch this play that was out a few years ago. And it's an inherently a privileged thing to see it. So for completionists out there, for folk that maybe can't travel to New York, etc., people are going to inherently miss out on something that could be of interest and ways to support it. So hopefully it comes in some capacity. I can't imagine it being a Hamilton style production that we'll get on Disney Plus, but hopefully someone's got some camcorders there and can upload it in some capacity for a pay what you want to pay sort of thing in the future, maybe.
Yeah, I'm a fan of live theatre, I'm a fan of Star Trek, and I'm a fan of New York City. So I'm going to see if I can try and figure out a way of wheedling my way up to New York and checking out a showing of it, right? Like, hey, how often are you going to have the opportunity to go see a stage production around Star Trek? That's also a musical. And like, even if it's not very good, I'd still like to see it and see it for myself, right? Like, because how often are you going to have the opportunity to do that, right? Sit in a theatre, live theatre, Star Trek-based musical. I mean, just all of that together says to me that at some point between May 4th and June 4th, I have to find someone who's willing to go with me and to go and see this and make a night of it. So, yeah, I think this is fun. As I say, I'm going to do my best to try and check it out at some point. And yeah, any excuse for a night in New York.
And I think we've been quite lucky here in the UK, well, more so London, of like in recent years, we've had Patrick Stewart on the stage numerous times, which I've been lucky to see. Like, unfortunately, just timing's got away from me, but George Takei's been putting on a brilliant leading show kind of recently and so on, which just timing wise, I've not had a chance to go down for work trip. Marina Sirtis recently. So, I suppose it's been quite good if you want to see actors in doing what they do. You know, so often we see these Trek actors and the next time we see them are perhaps at kind of conventions and events. But if we want to kind of see them doing the thing, we've had those opportunities recently. So this feels like something that a little bit different. I definitely feel I would make a bit of an effort to see it if it wasn't across the Atlantic. But if it was a trip on the Amtrak, you know, chuck on a few podcasts, go see a matinee, back home for the evening. That sounds like a good evening.
All right. Well, we've talked about the facts, and now let's speculate on what's going to happen in the future of Star Trek.
You make some very good points, Captain. But it's still all speculation and theory.
So each week, my guest and I give you a wish or theory we're nurturing about any of the shows or the future of the franchise. So Lee, let's hear your theory or wish for this week.
It's one I've definitely felt from the beginning, and I 100% feel it's going to happen. That we've spoken about which characters are coming back, who's been lucky enough to appear once or twice. I think we're definitely going to get Kate Mulgrew in the flesh as Janeway. It's been one me and my friend Carlos were chatting about a few weeks ago, and I can just see it where there's been that few mentions now of Janeway and how she influenced her. And I can imagine at this big finale when we see Federation Day, all the ships, and Janeway being wheeled out to give a speech and so on, and get those two back together again and so on. I feel that, you know, there's definitely still more legacy characters that we know of to come and those that aren't, but I think I think this is one that they're going to keep up their sleeve. I have a feeling that whatever is going to happen, this big changeling plan, I think we're going to see a climax in episode 9, and then the final episode is what probably they almost take the what you left behind option of like, get the battle, get all the war out of the way in the first 45 minutes. And then your last hour is, let's bring all this crew together. Let's have the emotional arc, the little moments, the small touches. Are we going to see perhaps Janeway make an appearance in those final 2 episodes? That's what I see. And that's where I feel it's kind of going to go, is that the climax of this isn't going to be like some of the other kind of Star Trek shows that we've seen where it's going to be explosions. It's going to be dramatic. Maybe the episode 9, but episode 10, I think, is going to be that emotional moment. And a lot of the moments that we were denied in something like Nemesis, that it cut all that stuff out. And I think someone like Metalis, he's not sitting there thinking, I want to make a big action show and that's where it ends. He's like, how do we get to these emotional arcs? And I think we're going to see that in the 10th episode. And I think it could be one of Trek's finest hours if it all goes well.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I mean, I had my list of legacy actors that I thought were going to appear in Picard season 3, which I gave before the season started. And Kate Mulgrew was on my list, but I acknowledged was the biggest reach. My 3 were Michelle Forbes, Nana Visitor, Kate Mulgrew. And, you know, I still feel pretty good about like Kate Mulgrew showing up from the perspective of, well, so I guess there's lots of reasons to think she won't, right? Like Terry Matalas has said explicitly, no, she's not going to be in season 3. She's exclusive to Prodigy. But showrunners have been known to lie to, you know, preserve surprises. And any answer other than no in that situation is automatically a yes. So until the last second of footage of season 3 airs, there's a possibility for Kate Mulgrew as Janeway. And as you say, given there have been mentions of the character, and given that the character is so important to 7 of 9's arc, and that 7 of 9 is sort of having a moment in this season where it's like, what is her calling? What is it she's ultimately going to do? Having Janeway there at some point feels like a no-brainer. It also feels to me continually, and I've talked about this in a previous episode with my theory about the Enterprise G showing up at the end of the show, that Picard season 3 is designed to do what Terry Matalas had kind of said it was going to do, which was sort of provide a emotionally satisfying closing chapter for the Next Generation cast and for the Berman era of Star Trek that would also have the prospect for then doing more in that time period as well. And like, how do you do that without potentially a Deep Space Nine character and without potentially another Voyager character showing up? And if there's a Voyager character showing up, in my opinion, it's almost certainly Janeway, particularly given Kate Mulgrew's affiliation with the franchise to this point, and the fact that they managed to hold the appearance of the TNG cast secret until they decided they wanted to reveal it. I think the same could be true for Kate Mulgrew as well. So yeah, I like your theory a lot.
Excellent. Yeah, well, I guess we'll find out in a few weeks' time, hopefully.
Well, my wish this week is, you mentioned, I can't remember if it was after we started filming or before, that Weekly Trek has a habit of like speaking things into existence. So my wish this week is a speaking things into existence wish. And that's that I would really like to know when the premiere of Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 2 will be. Like, I kind of feel like, all right, we've had some bad news over the last couple of weeks. It's time to have some good news. And Picard Season 3 is wonderful. But it's sort of getting to be, we're now past episode 4. Episode 5 is in the crosshairs. There's only 5 more after that. It would be really nice to get a sense of like, all right, what happens after episode 10? Now that we know Discovery's pushed to next year, that means it's almost certainly Strange New Worlds Season 2. It's almost certainly now, since it's only 6 weeks away from the finale of Picard, not going to be like 7 weeks away. I think there's definitely going to be a gap in between Picard Season 3 and Strange New Worlds Season 2. How long and when? That's what I would like to know. And I'd love to get a teaser trailer for Strange New Worlds Season 2 while we're at it. So that's my wish for this week. Lee, what do you think?
Yeah, it's one of those ones I'm almost kind of think to an extent. I always think of like I often think in Star Trek references and Simpsons references of like, I always think of when the guy turns up at the house of like, my wife, she is very angry. She wants to know, when are we getting this? When is it now? Why have you not gone off and asked that? Like, I'm the same. I'm a bit baffled where part of me thinks maybe you're the same sometimes, Alex, where for 90s Star Trek fans, part of me is still in that routine of like, it starts in sort of like September time, finishes about May, and there's a routine every time. Like these shows work to a cycle by and large, and the chaos of it all these past few years, I guess it's just the norm, and I like that they make these things when they're ready, but it throws me off when I can't confidently go, this is when I'm getting my next fix and so on. And I mean, I've had a hard enough time keeping track of when Prodigy is coming along and in what different phases it's coming along in. So yeah, it feels like Strange New Worlds has just been so bizarre. I'm looking forward to that first teaser, and I bet my life on it. Here's a bonus extra prediction is that I think it'll end with like, we'll see the Lower Decks characters in the flesh as the kind of final shot. We'll see like Lower Decks. Oh my God, what are we doing here?
Yep.
And, like, bam, like I can't wait for that moment, and I'm excited for it. So I just need that now, and yeah, I'm excited for that. But I suppose we've got to pace ourselves now, where we've still got a long year ahead. Discovery isn't going to be around till beginning of next year, maybe at the earliest, and so on, and we've got a long time to go till then. So yeah, we'll certainly wait and see. I think definitely a few weeks break at least, I think, will be really helpful to let us kind of mourn and reflect, I guess, on the end of Picard, and sit with those things and give people the chance to not overlap to an extent, but to pay tribute to these actors and to the talent if they can stick the landing, which I'm really hopeful that they will.
Well, and it has also just occurred to me, because the year is really getting away from me, that today is March 11th and April 5th is First Contact Day, and that is now less than 1 month away.
Absolutely. And on the 4th, I guess we get the early treat of the 4K upgrades will come. Yep. If you're someone that's got the Apple ones, you'll get the auto upgrade. So I'm immediately excited for the day before First Contact Day to watch. I mean, we don't have it in the UK, but I've heard about like the HBO has the Generations 4K, which I've heard looks absolutely stunning. And that's been the one I've been most excited for. And I kind of held off prior to Picard of rewatching those movies because I'm like, I just want to see them in 4K and not have to rewatch them. So like we've got two exciting days ahead, I think.
Yeah, it's 3.5 weeks away until First Contact Day. So I'm going to guess First Contact Day that's when we'll find out a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
Do you have a theory or a wish for Discovery, Picard, Strange New Worlds, Lower Decks, or Prodigy that you'd like to share? Tweet them to me at WeeklyTrek or email them to me at weeklytrek@thetricordertransmissions.com, and I might feature your theory in a future episode. Well, that's all the time we've got for this episode of Weekly Trek. Thank you so much to my guest, Lee Hutchison, for joining me today. Lee, how can people contact you if they want to continue the conversation?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at @LeeHutchison_ or at Star Trek VHS.
And you can find this show on Twitter at Weekly Trek and me at Alexander T. Perry. And if you enjoy the show, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on your podcast player of choice. And please check out some of the other great shows on the Tricorder Transmissions. And if you like our shows, please also consider becoming a Patreon of Tricorder, which you can find at patreon.com/the Tricorder Transmissions. And lastly, if you're looking for Star Trek news on the internet, I hope you will turn to trekcore.com. Well, thank you, Lee. Thank you to all of my listeners. And until next week, live long and prosper.